right, folks. Good evening. If you're able to hear us, welcome to this Farm Advisory Service webinar. My name's Alec Perry and I'm the host for tonight. I'm a general agricultural consultant working out of the Auchenkrove office here in Ayrshire. And tonight I am joined by my colleagues, Mary Young and Jos Houdjik, and we are going to be discussing Scotland's potential to feed protein, alternative protein sources to ruminants and monogastrics and see if there's any capacity there to increase production here in Scotland. Okay, so just a quick rundown for tonight. We aim to finish around about 9 o'clock. We might end up running a little long depending on how discussion is towards the end. We have two presentations lined up, one from Mary and one from Jos. We've prepared a couple of polls, questions for you to answer before we jump into the Q&A. So we'll run that after the second presentation. Please, throughout the night, if you have any questions, by all means, throw them into either the chat function or the Q&A section, and we'll pick them up once it comes time to the Q&A session. But with that in mind, I think what we'll do is we will jump right in with Mary, if you're good to go, Mary.
Yep, that's great. I will share my screen. Thanks for the introduction, Alex. Yeah, my name is Mary Young. I'm part of the livestock team at SAC. Most of my job is in nutrition, so I'm mainly beef and sheep cattle that I would focus on. So tonight's Alex had sort of asked me to focus mainly on beef cattle. So that's the sort of focus of my presentation. The things that I wanted to cover were feed value of legumes, what the sort of growing cattle nutritional requirements are. I've given a few examples of what replacing your major protein sources like rapeseed meal and soya bean with legumes and how that can look in a creep mix and growing rations. Alex had asked for a little bit on buying options as well, and I've got a few other resources that I just wanted to highlight and make you aware of to finish. So the first thing, the actual feed value of legumes, I've mainly focused on peas and beans in this webinar. I've also put in the feed value of lupins. I don't know how much lupins is fed in Scotland or how widely available it would be, but just thought for interest I would add in what their sort of feed value is. And I've put a comparison with wheat dark grains, which would be quite a popular source of protein as well. It's fed in Scotland, and high pro soya as well for comparison. So the first thing on this table, the first two columns there are your peas and beans, and the first row is the energy value. So when we look in ruminant nutrition, we tend to talk about metabolizable energy for ruminants. So that's the energy of the feed, total feed, minus the losses. It takes into consideration the losses from basically when the animal pees, poops and burps, and that is what is left as your metabolizable energy. So you can see that peas and beans are quite a good level of energy, very comparable to your wheat dark grains and your high pro soya. Also be similar to your cereals, your barley, your wheat. So good energy source. I know when we're talking about legumes in the ration, it tends to be the protein alternative that we're looking at, and it as how it can be used as a protein source. But I think it's worth bearing in mind as well that the actual energy value that it provides is also very good. I highlighted on the bottom row there the starch content, so you can see it's quite a bit higher in starch than your wheat dark grains and your high pro soya. So that's something to bear in mind, especially for your growing animals, that benefit that starch can bring as well as the protein source. The protein content itself, you can see for peas, it's just slightly lower than beans, about 26% on a dry matter basis and 29% in your beans. A little bit higher again in your lupins. Obviously, it's quite difficult to find a feed as high value in protein as high pro soya. You can see it's not quite as high in crude protein, but a really good level when you're thinking about wheat dark grains and those sort of protein alternatives. On the DUP side, that's your bypass protein. So that's the digestible undegradable protein. As you can see, soya is always going to be the highest level of DUP when you're looking at these sort of feed values, but there is a small percentage of bypass protein in your peas and beans, but the majority of it will be the rumen degradable type of protein. So the beans feed value, I just wanted to give a sort of overall summary of the beans and peas when looking at legume alternatives. So as I already said, the majority of the protein will be that rapidly degradable form in the rumen. It's primarily grown for its edible seeds, but you can also whole crop beans. Can be quite difficult to do, but it is doable. Unlike barley whole crop and things like that, it has quite a high buffering capacity, so that's where it can be quite tricky in whole crop. But another alternative, although tonight's mainly focused on feeding it as the grain. Some level of processing is required just to ensure you get the adequate digestion of your protein and starch. So most processing will involve either rolling, cracking, coarse grinding, or steam flaking. Also, if you're buying concentrate feeds, you might have seen on the back of the label micronized beans. That's another form of processing that your compounders might use, you might have seen. It can be difficult to process as it becomes quite pasty, especially if there's quite a high moisture content. So that's something to bear in mind. It has to be quite dry before the processing. Some of its starch is unfermented in the rumen, so around 18% of it won't be fermented in the rumen. So that makes it slightly safer than your cereals. If you think about wheat or barley that can be quite rapidly degraded in the rumen, we talk about the risks of acidosis with high cereal content rations. Because some of the starch bypasses the rumen, that makes it slightly safer. But also you still get the benefit of the energy. Good palatability, but it's really important to prevent mold growth from processing. On the mineral side of things, I thought it was worth just noting that it's generally low in calcium, manganese, and iron, but tends to have a high phosphorus content, although the availability of the phosphorus can be variable. A lot of rations, particularly on your meal type of stock, whether that be your calves or lambs, tend to look at this calcium phosphorus ratio, particularly in the risk of urinary caliculi. But generally, depending on how much obviously of the beans is in the ration, your inclusion levels shouldn't be so high that that's a concern, but just something to bear in mind when you're looking at that. So I thought it would just be useful to give some general feeding rates for beans, and then I'll move on to peas. So for calves, generally beans are fed in a coarse mix and contain up to about 150 kilos per tonne. I've expressed most things on a kilos per tonne basis, but in percentage, that's just 15% of the mix for calves up to 3 months of age, and then it can be increased thereafter. So as the rumen's starting to develop, and it can start to increase. So for adult beef cattle with a fully developed rumen, around 250 kilos per tonne of the concentrate mix is around about where they say is ideal as an inclusion rate for beans. I've also included sheep as well. I know I said I was going to mainly talk about cattle, but can't help but throw in some sheep nutrition. But generally can be fed whole, up to about 150 for lambs and up to 250 for your ewes in a kilogram per tonne basis. So moving on to peas. I don't think I meant to put transitions in here, but we'll go with that. So it's similar in feed value to your beans, but slightly lower in protein. It's high in sugar and starch, and approximately similar to the beans that's talking about. Some of that starch is unfermented in the rumen, so about 15% bypasses rumen. It's seen as quite a safe feed as well. Similar issues to beans though with rancidity if not careful, so ground peas can go off quite quickly. I should have said that with the beans as well. If you're grinding beans, you want to make sure that you're doing it in batches and only keeping them for a short amount of time, so you don't want to leave it for too long as that can go off quite quickly. So peas feeding rates, again, generally for calf feeds, peas would usually be flaked in a coarse mix. It's quite common, and levels are typically up to about 100 kilos per tonne. For your beef cattle, I should say, for similar to beans as well, that can increase as the rumen starts to develop. But in an adult beef animal, inclusions around 200 kilograms per tonne, and I would say as a max going up to about 500 kilograms per tonne. And again, for the sheep, similar inclusion rates as the beans, can be fed whole as long as they're not too dry, and same inclusion rate of 150 to 250 for the ewes in kilograms per tonne. Also wanted to just touch on protein requirements for the growing cattle. Don't worry, this isn't a nutrition lecture. I just thought this would be quite a useful diagram just to show what I'm talking about when I mention degradable protein, bypass protein, what I'm on about. So basically the degradable protein, as you can see, I hover my mouse over, this is the protein that gets broken down in the rumen by these rumen bugs, and they need energy as well to capture that degradable protein. So think of urea, that's 100% degradable protein, and that can be utilized by these rumen bugs. But a lot of the protein in the peas and beans will be in this form of degradable protein. So they use this form alongside energy to make what's called microbial protein, and that for the majority of beef cattle, a lot of their protein requirements will come from the microbial protein. The really high producing animals or young animals where the rumen's not quite fully developed, that's where your DUP, your bypass protein, comes in. I know Jos has done a lot of work in ewes and late pregnancy as well, so there's really high intensive producing animals. That's where your bypass protein is important. So when we talk about protein requirements, you're probably used to looking at your concentrate labels and seeing a crude protein percentage. That's generally what most people talk about in nutrition. And the animal doesn't necessarily have a crude protein requirement. It's really the metabolizable protein that's what the animal needs, and that's what's made up from this microbial protein and bypass protein. So that's what we're trying to achieve in protein nutrition when it comes to beef animals and sheep as well. So feed requirements for the calves at 4 months of age, about half of its feed requirements should be met by grass or silage or concentrates. At this stage in the animal's life, that's when it's most efficient. So it's able to convert about 4 kilos of creep to 1 kilogram of gain. So obviously the benefits are there. You can't buy back that benefit later on in its life. So you want to maximize that as much as possible. Obviously, creep feeding also has the benefits of increasing weaning weight and reducing pneumonia risk at housing. On the right-hand side, my 6.5-month-old calf, when we're starting to go to the weaning stage at about 200 days, 3/4 of its nutrition should be coming from other sources than milk. So it's just going to touch on sort of creep feed mixes and where legumes can play a role there. So the sort of general standards for a creep mix, you're looking for around 14 to 16% crude protein as fed. Generally, you'll start them a wee bit higher at about 18% and then reduce that over time. And then an energy value of about 12.5 as a minimum. So you want good high energy feeds in your creep mix. Cereals should be lightly processed and oats can be fed whole. And then a digestible fiber source like sugar beet pulp or soya hulls is also useful in creep mixes, and a mineral and vitamin supplement as well. So I just thought I'd put up a few examples of creep mixes based on those inclusion levels that I was talking about for peas and beans. So my first creep mix is soybean as the protein source. So it's made up of barley, soya, and sugar beet pulp, and minerals and vitamins. You'll see along the bottom, I've also stated the ME of that mix and the crude protein level. So I've tried to keep it fairly standard across each mix, the same ME and same crude protein levels. The first value of crude protein is on a fresh weight basis. In the second column, I've replaced the soya bean with peas and maize dark grains. As I said, the peas generally inclusion rate of about 100 kilos, but you could start to increase that over time and reduce your inclusion of maize dark grains. And similar with the sugar beet pulp, over time, as their ruminants have adjusted, you can start to reduce that and increase the barley content of the creep feed. And then on the very far right-hand column, I've got beans and maize dark grains as a replacement for soya. So 3 really good mixes, all providing the same sort of energy, crude protein levels, and all sort of balanced equally with just 3 different protein sources. So these are the sort of crude protein targets that we look for in the overall ration when rationing for growing cattle. It's between sort of 12 and 16%. Your higher end would be for your intensive finishing bulls that would be going on to probably a high barley content ration, and they're just pushed that little bit harder, so they're laying on, or they're gaining weight a bit faster than your regular sort of growing animal. The finishing cattle between sort of 12 and 14%, similar range for the higher intensively fed animals. And then for lactating suckler, about 11%, and a dry suckler, about 9%. Just put the sucklers in as well for information, but most of what I'm talking about is based on growing cattle. So an example of a growing ration that in the first column, I've just gone for a sort of basic barley and rapeseed meal fed with grass silage versus grass silage with barley and beans as your protein source, and then grass silage with barley and peas as the protein source. So again, I've balanced them to make sure that I'm meeting their ME requirements for a 400 kilogram steer growing 1 kilo a day. And I've also balanced it so the crude protein of the ration is the same, so 12% crude protein. So you can see they're eating pretty much the same level of silage in each of those rations. Barley is about the same, slightly reduced in the beans and peas. Again, good energy sources from the beans and peas. But the total concentrate is the same, or roughly the same level, about 3.5 kilos. But yeah, you can see that beans and peas can make a good alternative for rapeseed meal in this example, and can balance quite nicely with barley. For buying options, I wasn't too sure in Scotland how much beans and peas were grown. So I'd had a look on the Climate Exchange website. I just put the reference down below there for interest, but they did a report and said that in 2020, the area of peas and beans represented only about 0.4% of the tillage area in Scotland. So it's not particularly high, really. Which, and they also mentioned in this report that the land most suited to growing legume crops lie in the east of Scotland and lowland areas. So that does kind of limit your options a little bit if you're not in these areas, but potentially partnering with an arable neighbour could be an option. I also thought it was worth mentioning if you're specifically buying in concentrate feeds and you're looking at a label and seeing what protein sources are in there, and you're trying to avoid soya, or just wanting to get local homegrown protein alternatives. Problems that compound feeds, they're designed months in advance with production that runs requiring certainty of the inputs, which are sourced in bulk. So the lack of supply and is relatively unfavorable, so makes them generally unattractive with raw materials unless a supplier knows that they have a good constant supply that they can rely on. You may find that the concentrate feeds don't always have legumes included. I also was aware that Jos, as a researcher, would be talking a lot about his research in peas and beans and the pigs and poultry side. So I thought it was worth adding in research that has been done on the beef cattle side as well. This was a research trial that was actually just published in May 2021 that was done in Switzerland on finishing bulls. It was were fed grass and maize silage with a concentrate, and the protein was either made up of soya bean or faba beans. There was a few other protein sources that they also tested, pumpkin seed cake and things like that I haven't included. But what they did find when they compared the different groups, that was that the bulls of all groups had comparable daily live weight gains of about 1.43 kilos a day and similar feed intakes. They also found there wasn't any difference in carcass and meat quality, which I think is really important when we're talking about beef cattle. And the results indicated that soybean meal could be directly replaced with alternative proteins without affecting the performance or meat quality. So that was quite an interesting study, and because it was published so recently. And there was another study done in America, not quite as recently, it was in 2007, done on peas. And that was a study on Holstein and Angus steers. Again, it was fed as a TMR with hay being the base of the ration, and a concentrate that was either made up of maize and rapeseed meal or maize and field peas. So they formulated each of the rations to 12% crude protein. And in that study, they observed higher dry matter intake and average daily gain in the steers that were fed the field peas compared to the control of rapeseed meal. So I think it just shows that you can get good performance from animals when fed these alternative proteins, and it sort of backs up that idea. Before we started this, Alex said this was actually advertised through the Legumes Translated website, so you may already be aware, but I just thought it might be of interest that this is available, the Legumes Translated, and the work that's being done, and SRUC Dairy Group are part of that as well. In a meeting today, this was brought up that the Northern Irish pilot protein crop scheme was launched this year in 2021. So there was a scheme basically to encourage farmers to uptake using legumes or growing legumes in Northern Ireland. And from that scheme, they saw an uptake of 300% compared to 2020. So I think that does show that if the incentive is there, there is farmers willing to try growing more legumes. And also the area sown was markedly up 450% compared to 2020. So that was all I was going to cover on the beef cattle side. Hope I haven't gone too much of my time, but I'll hand over to Jos now.
Right, thank you very much for the invitation. So Mary talked about ruminants, and I'm going to talk to you about pigs and poultry, but we're talking about the same kind of aspect. We're looking at homegrown legumes as alternative protein sources. So my name is Jos Houdjik. As you can hear from my accent, I'm not Scottish, I'm not British, I'm Dutch. I came to Edinburgh in 1998 for 2 years and not a day longer. And how things have changed, because I'm still here. And over the years, I've been doing lots of work on protein nutrition in many species, and of late in pigs and poultry. So, but by means of a little bit of background, in pig and poultry nutrition in particular, we rely rather heavy on soybean meal. And that's because it's an excellent nutritional value, it's great palatability, and it's year-round available. And it's always good to remember that the reason why the feed industry has become a user of soybean meal is that, say, 25 years ago, it was seen as a co-product from the soya oil industry. So essentially, it was a byproduct. It was the industry was asked to do something useful with it, and we can. And because it is such a good quality material, we've become reliant on it. Now, that's all fine if there is no issues with it, but we know there are. There are concerns with reliance on soya in relationship to the environmental footprint. You will have heard of food miles, but essentially for soya, that needs to come from the other side of the world as well. So we need to think about feed miles. We need to think about the fact that where soya is being grown, other things used to grow. We have land use change to consider. And last but not least, soya is quite variable in prices. Currently, the prices are not too bad, but a couple of months ago, it was rather high. And then you feel the pressure of, can we do something else? Can we use a homegrown material? So what about homegrown alternatives? And in the UK, we can grow legumes. We can also grow oilseed and use the rapeseed meal. And there is ample opportunity for using those because we can grow them within the UK. And I'll show you some pictures here of plots that were grown in near Aberdeen. My colleague Robin Walker is doing work there on agronomy of peas and beans and lupins. You see at the top sole fields and at the bottom intercropped with barley. Robin also tried to grow soya in Scotland. And we have to agree that although climate warming is happening, it's not ready yet for soya. So they tried 4 species. One of them had a little bit of growth and the others didn't grow at all. But so soya in Scotland, not yet. So let's therefore look at these alternatives. And the work that I'm going to talk about a little bit is looking at, okay, what kind of levels of peas and beans can we use in our pigs and chickens, because it's not new. We have been using peas and beans for quite some time, but it has come out of fashion because of soya. And as with oilseed rape and with barley and wheat, varieties of peas and beans change all the time. So we need to reassess whether there is an upper limit that we need to consider. We also have the possibility to think about alternative products that are derived from legumes, and I'm going to show a couple of examples there as well. And it's going to be a whistle tour of some projects, and I named them here. I'm not going to spend too much on this slide, but some of these projects I will spend a little bit of time on in the next couple of slides. The first project, we call that the Green Pig project. You see there on the right side, and our logo, which looks like a pig and a pot in between. In the Green Pig project, we asked the question, can we reduce our reliance on soya by increasing confidence in using peas and beans? So what we did in that study, we first did a small scale study here in Edinburgh, where we looked at different levels of peas and beans inclusion, and you see that in these graphs on the x-axis. So we range from no peas and beans up to 30% peas and beans. And on the y-axis, you see in the top body weight gain and at the bottom feed conversion ratio. And it's fair to say that these lines are very, very straight. And that means that we can certainly increase the levels of peas and beans. And at levels of 30%, that meant without feeding any soya at all. But that is small scale. And small scale, you always ask yourself, okay, what would happen at larger scale? So in this project, we were able to increase the size of the trial by doing a commercial trial. Let's focus on the right side here, forget about the left side for now. The right side was a trial where we used 1,200 pigs, which we grew from 30 kilo to slaughter, either on a soya diet, which are the red bars, on a peas diet, 30% peas, which are the blue bars, and on a bean diet, which are the black bars. And it would be fair to say, if you look at these graphs, that none of them seem to be negatively affected. And one of the most important outcomes of that trial was the farm manager who ran these trials. He couldn't see the difference from the outside, whether the pigs were fed soya, peas, or faba beans. and they also graded very well. The carcass quality was excellent. So from that point of view, there is certainly great opportunity. In this project, we were able to debunk some myths as well. In any industry, then the feed industry is not dissimilar. Old habits die hard, and a good couple of years ago or decades ago, there was some information that suggested that if you feed high levels of peas, you'll get boar taint in your meat, and you get dirty pigs, and you get diarrhea and loose feces. So in our studies, we tried to see if we actually saw some evidence of that. So we measured boar taint indirectly in the form of backfed scatol and indole, and we measured fecal consistency directly by measuring the dry matter contents in the feces. And we were able to debunk both of them. This is a slide that shows the effect of feeding more pulses on the levels of backfed scatol and indole, the components of boar taint. And what you can see there is that if anything, these lines are going downwards rather than upwards, suggesting that there is absolutely no risk of increasing boar taint. Same with fecal dry matter. You can imagine that diarrhea has a very low fecal dry matter. So what we didn't want to see was these lines going down. And indeed, if anything, we see these lines going up. So these two myths we were able to debunk, and that was a real take-home message from this project for the industry. So that is with regards to feeding peas and beans to grower and finisher pigs. Out of that project came a side project that looked at can we actually make use of faba bean fractions as well? Because we ended up in a project where we worked together with salmon growers and salmon feeders, and a technology that allowed us to separate the beans into different fractions. One of the fractions was very rich in protein, and the salmon boys wanted to get their hands on to feed the salmon instead of fish meal. And the residue, which was relatively rich in starch, still had a decent amount of protein. And we are asked ourselves, well, perhaps we can feed chickens and pigs with that, and perhaps that could be an alternative to soya. So the first thing we did is to establish the nutritional value of the product. And we do that by doing digestibility studies. And in the case of pigs and poultry, we're looking at the digestibility of specific components of the protein, the amino acids. And on the basis of the information that we derived from these kind of digestibility studies, we can then inform diets, optimized diet formulation, in order to see, okay, how high can we go in these diets with this commodity to reduce our reliance on soya? Again, we did that in pigs, and the next slide shows that if we increase this commodity, the bean starch concentrates, we could increase that up to 30% in the diet, completely replacing soya, and the pigs couldn't care less. They grew as fast as if they were on a soya diet, and they convert as efficient as if they were on a soya diet. So all looking very good. So far, I've been talking about pigs. So now let's go over to more recent work where we asked ourselves, can we also see these kind of benefits in broilers, in the meat chickens? And in a first study, we introduced a small amount of faba beans in the starter diet of broilers. Broilers are growing very fast from 0 days to about 35 days before they're being processed. And that is going into 3 phases, a starter, a grower, and a finisher phase. And in the starter phase, in this specific study, we thought, okay, let's see what happens if we put only 5% faba beans in there. And we came to the conclusion that that's actually not so good. we saw a reduction in gain, we saw a reduction in feed intake, and an increased feed conversion ratio. In other words, a negative effect on feed conversion ratio. Now you might say, okay, if that is in the starter phase, if they can compensate thereafter, then it doesn't matter. But when we follow up on this study all the way to slaughter, we had to conclude that we didn't see a compensation. What we saw was that over the whole production cycle, we saw a reduction in weight gain, a reduction in feed intake, and at the same level of feed conversion ratio, but it was certainly not positive. So from this, we kind of understand that for broilers, we should stay away from this very first phase where the animal is probably too sensitive for the anti-nutritional factors that are in the faba beans. Perhaps if we can process the faba beans, there may be more scope, but certainly not as raw as we use them in this trial. So we then went over to the more older birds, and in bird terminology, we call them the grower and the finisher broilers. And we did a dose response study. In the same way how we did it with the pigs, we increased the levels of faba beans from, in this case, from 0% to 20%. And if you look a little bit at the graphs on your right side, you see that as the levels of faba beans increase, we see a dramatic increase in weight gain, an increase in feed intake, and a reduction, that is a benefit, in feed conversion ratio. And that was very surprising to us. We were not expecting to see that in the absence of faba beans, that the chickens were actually doing very, very poorly. So we were very surprised about that observation. And we had to realize that this was a trial where we didn't use coccidiostats. And we also had a starter meal that was in the form of a meal. So in the subsequent study, we explored to see if some of these components were the consequence of this very odd observation. And to cut a long story short, it was probably a fluke because we couldn't repeat it. So in a study that we did after that, we compared feeding soya-rich diets with faba bean-rich diets and with soya diets that had coccidiostats in it. And to cut a long story short, what you see in this graph, you see absolutely no difference between the colors. The red bars and the blue bars and the black bars are effectively the same, meaning that we can get a very good gain and very good feed intake in the broilers at 15% faba bean inclusion. We also had to observe that these chickens were growing at a very, very high very, very high efficiency, very low feed conversion ratio, just shy of 1.3. And that was well above target. So we're asking ourselves currently whether if these chickens are a bit under more infection pressure, whether we see the same kind of responses. And that's a trial that hopefully will happen in the autumn. So one final slide before rounding off is a novel product. I was lucky to be involved in an EU project where people were using faba beans to brew beer. And essentially what they did is together with Barney Beers here in Edinburgh, they produced a beer where 30% of the malted barley was replaced with dehulled faba beans. The beer tastes very nice, so that's a winner already. But as a co-product, you get then a spent barley bean mixture, which compared to a normal spent barley will have higher levels of protein because more protein goes into the system. And we were trying to see if that spent barley beans could be a useful novel feed for chickens. So we did a digestibility study, and in that study we compared the nutritional value of this spent barley beans with that of barley and dehulled faba beans. And as expected, we saw that the nutritional value of that was in between, because it's a mixture of barley and dehulled beans after all. But it was actually very similar to that of soya in terms of digestibility. What we also observed here in this little digestibility study, where we used whole beans rather than dehulled beans, and the digestibility of whole beans was much reduced compared to dehulled beans. And that suggests to us that dehulling faba beans is probably a very useful way to increase the nutritional value and therefore get more out of our homegrown protein sources. Before coming to the overall conclusion, I do want to say something about the environmental footprint as well, because we're talking here about using homegrown protein source to try to reduce our reliance on soya in order to combat global warming and etc. And we can do some calculations on whether we can achieve that through a so-called life cycle assessment, which essentially is a calculation technique that tries to account for all the components of the carbon footprint in a product, and in this case was per kilogram pig live weight gain. And what we saw in this little graph, you see on the right side, you see the global warming potential for peas and faba beans, and I compare that with 3 scenarios for using soya. The first one I call worst case scenario, which is where all the soya needs to come from new land. In other words, we need to account for the deforestation of the rainforest. The second scenario is what I refer to as best estimate soybean meal. It's where the global warming potential for the soya is associated with a kind of in-between mixture of where it comes from. The last one, the middle one, is sustainable soya, and sustainable soya is the soya that is being grown at land that has been converted so many years ago that any kind of negative effect from that conversion is long accounted for. And depending on how you compare that, you see that the benefit of using peas or faba beans differs. So it compares to the worst case scenario, we see a benefit of almost 30% reduction in carbon footprint. But in case of sustainable soya, the benefit is relatively small. Associated with that, we also saw a benefit in acidification potential, and that has to do with the fuel that is being used from transporting soya from around the world to here. And we saw a reduction in eutrophication potential. Essentially, that is the consequence of bringing less nitrogen into the country. So that looks quite promising, you would say. But from a scientific point of view, we then say, well, yeah, all these figures will have a degree of uncertainty around it. And when you do some modeling, this kind of big differences actually are not necessarily statistically significant, but it goes in the right direction. So there's certainly opportunity. So to come home, to take the take home message, I think these kind of studies are starting to show us that provided commercial availability constraints can be overcome, and that's something that Mary already alluded to. In other words, what we're saying, if we have them, if we can use them, I would say bring them on. Peas and beans are really viable homegrown proteins alternatives to reduce our reliance on soybean meal in nutritionally balanced diets for both broilers and fattening pigs. And I underlined here nutritionally balanced, because remember I did these kind of digestibility studies, so we know the nutritional value of them. Provided that we use that information in diets and we can make nutritionally balanced diets, we can use quite a lot of them to reduce our reliance on soya. So with that, I want to thank the funders that have been behind all this work, the many people and technicians that have been associated with the actual studies. And last but not least, you yourself for your attention to the chat, and happy to take any questions. Thank you very much.
I'd just like to remind you guys, if you do have any questions, now is the time to jump into the chat or the Q&A, and we'll field them to Mary or Jos as we go. I think I'll kick off if that's okay with a question for you, Mary. You talked about beef and you mentioned sheep rations as well. Is there any top tips out there for dairy farmers who might be tuning in?
Yeah, so I didn't actually mention dairy cattle, but as I said, in the Legumes Translated project, the dairy group at SRUC are part of that. So they have been doing a lot of work down at the Crichton and replacing soybean meal with I think it's faba beans, and they're also using protected rapeseed meal. And Lorna McPherson has done a lot of that work in translating out sort of knowledge exchange from the Crichton. But they have found that the milk yields have been consistent, and also the quality of the milk, so the protein and butter fats haven't been impacted by using these alternative proteins. I think it is something that people, I suppose, as Jos alluded to as well, the sustainability of soybean, and people are becoming more conscious of what they're putting in their rations. And obviously with dairy animals, as I was saying, with those high producing animals, the need for that bypass protein and fear of not having that in quite high yielding animals. They do have a select herd, select genetic herd at the Crichton as well, but they find that with, I think it's the protected rapeseed meal as well that has made a big difference in removing the soybean, as showed with the feed values of peas and beans. Their DUP level is quite low, but certainly a good source of degradable protein for dairy animals.
If I can add something that from an environmental point of view for the ruminants, in some of my messages, I was talking about anti-nutritional factors in pulses, and especially in faba beans. You have something that's called condensed tannins. And condensed tannins, we all know, because they are what makes the tea a little bit bitter if you don't put milk in it, and what makes the wine dry if you like that. These tannins actually can reduce methane production as well. So there is an added benefit of using faba beans in ruminants with regards to the environmental footprint by reducing the level of methane production. We have yet to demonstrate that in our own hands, but there is work done elsewhere that seems to suggest that in that direction. So what I'm trying to say here is that these kind of alternatives have lots of different components that all seem to say go in the right direction and combinedly can make a big difference.
Great.
Yeah, it's often seen as a negative, the condensed tannins, wasn't it?
Yeah, but no, yes, but below a threshold, condensed tannins actually improve performance as well, because they help to increase bypass protein. But it's all about what is the best level. But from that point of view, even too much water is poisonous. So there is always an upper limit, isn't it?
Yeah.
We do have another question just come in there. Do you see feed companies increasing the amount of legumes that they have in their mixes and their nuts? I suppose that's an open question to either of you.
Yeah, if I can start there, because on Tuesday night we had a discussion with around this topic with some representatives of the feed industry in Scotland, and their main concern is what Mary already alluded to, is consistent supply of a good product. Because without consistency, without consistent supply, feed compounders are very reluctant to change their formulation. Having said that, where we do see more of legumes being used is in the so-called home mixing. Quite a few enterprises in Scotland are using the feed industry through so-called home mixing, where the feed industry helps to, let's say, supply the missing ingredient in what is available on the farm. And there, I see, let's say, perhaps a greater possibility for a larger uptake. But unless we crack this nut of consistent supply, the big feed compounders are probably right so a little bit reluctant to really make a big change.
That's brilliant. Another question coming in here. Could reduced or no soya become part of various contracts or quality assurance schemes? And could this make the use of legumes in Scotland more prominent?
Mary?
I'm not sure about the assurance schemes, if that would become a requirement, but certainly the way discussions are moving with Scottish government, then I could see that happening, certainly, especially with supermarkets as well, and the promises that they're making to consumers to reduce the reliance on soya. Sorry, do you have something there, Jos?
Yeah, at this point, I don't think it is in any of the quality assurance schemes as a kind of rule to try to adhere to, but farmers who for themselves decide to go in that direction and create a kind of niche market to have their own produce being sold by state demonstrating that it's done with a minimum amount or with no soya being used, are finding niches, and here and there you see some interactions between specific supermarket chains, especially the more the upper markets, if you like, appearing. And ultimately, it's all about incentives, I think. If from a farmer's point of view, there is an incentive to go in that direction where the possible additional cost associated is recouped from a higher price of the produce, then I think there is a general feeling that that goes in that direction, because then more and more people in the industry will become aware of the fact that these kind of alternative ways of feeding, more local produced stuff, etc., will help to to reduce the carbon footprint, to reduce the environmental footprint, but also to increase the imago, the brand name of the home produced material, and generally going working together on a society where we do the best for the climate rather than only for the pocket. But at the same time, the pocket is a powerful driver. So without incentives, for instance, from the government or elsewhere, it remains a struggle. But provided these incentives are there, I see great opportunities.
All right. What I'll do, thanks, Jos. I'll just finish the polling and we'll take a look at some of the results that's been running for 10 minutes now. So okay. I can see here that 69% of the audience are beef producers. So well done, Mary, for targeting them with your presentation. That's grand. We do have some dairy and sheep farms out there, and 23% of the audience have said that they don't have livestock, or at least none of the above. So I can only assume there are some arable folk out there as well. But good to have you here. Currently, nobody is growing their own legumes for feed in the chat. And 85% of the audience have come back to say that yes, they would like to have a better understanding of feed and nutrient requirements for their livestock. So that's encouraging. Interestingly, 69% of the audience have disagreed that it's more important to have a good source of protein than where it comes from. So maybe that's encouraging from a sustainability standpoint, and hopefully that might mean that some folk out there will be encouraged to give this a go. And again, 62% of the audience have disagreed that the quality of their land prevents them from growing their own protein sources. So if anybody's able to, it'd be really interesting to see in the chat, what is the main barrier to you producing legumes on your own farm? But no, thanks very much for sharing that. That's really interesting stuff.
Can I make a small observation there? Because it has often been suggested that if by the use of homegrown proteins, we may not get the high level of production that you can get on soya, but as long as you can get by and it makes say a margin, etc. It's something that is very useful. Mm-hmm. It's quite interesting that in the discussion that we had on Tuesday night, that was received with a bit of caution, because we should not forget that if, for argument's sake, by using homegrown protein sources, we reduce our overall efficiency by 5-10%, for argument's sake, then the effect of that in itself will actually be an extra burden to environmental footprint. So we do need to work in the area where we don't interfere with overall efficiency as we know it now. So what I'm trying to say here is that whilst there is lots to say for just take a view of just get rid of soya and we'll just go back to try our best with what we have. That may in the long run not necessarily be the best option. So the way how I see it is that in the long run there will be a place for a certain amount of soya that provided that can be sustainably sourced, etc., and perhaps even within Europe or even south of England nowadays. But it is that reduced reliance and not the complete abandonment of it, I think. Because then we may go down a slippery slope that we don't want to go there, and then throw away babies with bathwaters.
No, that's a good point. Yeah. An incredibly complicated issue to balance out, a lot of factors flying about. Yeah. There's two questions here in the Q&A, so we'll just get to them. They are arable focused, so if we're unable to answer them here tonight, we'll get back in touch with you guys. But the first question here is, how easily are these crops harvested, and is it a specialist operation requiring specialist machinery? Jos, do you have any particular thoughts?
Funny is mentioned, because on Tuesday night that came up, one of the speakers was an arable farmer in Northern Ireland. Mm-hmm. And when he started with peas and beans and lupins and lentils, and then he has tried them all, and he is doing quite a lot of lentils. Lupins seem to be going very well for him. He was pleasantly surprised that his normal combine harvester equipment was able to harvest the crops without too much of a problem. So of course that was only one person saying, so there may be some other people have a different view, but I was quite encouraged from what I heard there.
Yeah, I have heard that advantage as well, that because you're harvesting at a different time to your barley and wheat and your cereals, that's another advantage that the combine's available. So I think others have found that an experience that you can use the normal combine.
Brilliant. Yep. And the last question for tonight, quite a story here. So apologies. I'll see if I can shorten it. In the past, the person asking this question has grown lupins and triticale undersown with a grass clover mix, and went on to harvest it as silage once the lupin pods were full, but before they dried off. The silage value when analysed was not much better than grass silage in and of itself. Any suggestions as to why this could be? And there's a point here that lupins are really easy to grow. This person from the Aberfeldy area, but they often don't get good weather as they're late to harvest. Any comments there?
No, I'm afraid that it goes too far away from my own expertise. But what I have heard from lupins, if you grow them as a sole crop, that relative to other commodities, that the yield, the nutrient content is quite high, but the yield per hectare is relatively low, and that's what has turned quite a few people off. But that's something that is also changing, because agronomy changes all the time, and the fact that Tuesday night somebody was talking about lupins and is now the sole lupin supplier in Northern Ireland, etc., suggests that may be another one of those myths that you should just try. But this specific question, no, I'm afraid I can't answer.
Yeah, I think the first thing as you were reading that out, Alex, I was just thinking of the proportions of triticale to lupins might make a big difference as well, because triticale is not particularly high in protein. But yeah, I don't have much to add to that.
No, that's absolutely fine. I think in the interest of getting an answer back to you, we'll maybe approach John or Robin, who spoke at the first webinar, and see if they have any comments. So I'll make a point to get back in touch with you, but thanks very much for the question. Conscious that we're now past 9 o'clock and all of the questions seem to have been answered. So I'd just like to thank everybody for coming on to this webinar tonight. Like I say, there are recordings for the first webinar, and a recording will be made available for tonight's meeting as well. But thanks very much for joining us, folks. Hope you've enjoyed the two-part series, and stay in touch with the Farm Advisory Service for more upcoming events in your area and across Scotland. Thanks very much, and good night.